welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the weather. Thank you for being here this afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Alex Katz. I'm co-chair of the Council of Christians and Jews Victoria, together with Reverend Dr. Colleen O'Reilly AM. It's my pleasure and great honour to welcome everyone here today. Before we actually say any more, I'm going to hand over to Pam Siegel, who's the president here at Hayim.
It is so nice to see so many people here. I wish we got this many people. So on behalf of the Board of Hayim, we're very excited to have you here today. We acknowledge the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation as the original inhabitants and caretakers of the land on which we live, work and pray. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, just as the Bunurong people hold the eagle hawk and crow totem as a symbol of their creation story. The mezuzah on the door of our synagogue represents our own unique story and values. We welcome any First Nations people who are here with us today. Thank you.
Just as we start this 40th annual general meeting, I'd just like to say what a privilege it is to be with the CCJ at this particular time and commend it for its continuing work to build relationships between people, dialogue, break down fear and prejudice, particularly among Christians and Jews. And it's a work that is continually needing to be strengthened. How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. It is like precious oil poured on the head, running down on the beard, running down on Aaron's beard, down on the collar of his robe. It is as if the dew on Hermon were falling on Mount Zion. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. I'd just like to say a couple of words about Shirley Sedawie. That we claim her because she was a sister of Our Lady of Zion, and I can just remember her enthusiasm for the scriptures and everything to do with dialogue and peace and justice.
We now transition into, as Pat said, the Shirley Sedawie Oration. We have a very privileged guest with us, Professor Kim Rubenstein, who's come to us all the way from Canberra, so we thank you for coming to Melbourne for the oration. I know you're here anyway, but still, thank you for being here. The topic is up on the screen, Recalibrating Citizenship in the 21st Century. In this presentation, Professor Rubenstein will share some of her work around citizenship as membership and participation by examining democracies around the world where polarisation and religious extremism is impacting the quality of citizenship. You probably saw Kim's bio, so I'm not going to read out all of it. I just want to say that she's a professor in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra. She's also a graduate in the University of Melbourne and Harvard, and she's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law and the Australian Academy of Sciences, and most importantly this year was awarded the Council of Australian Law's Dean's Lifetime Achievement Medal. So just recently, so we're in the presence of greatness. So thank you very much, Kim.
Well, thank you, Alex and Colleen, for the work that you are undertaking stewarding this very important organisation. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present. I see this act of reconciliation as fundamentally important, as we are privileged to be sitting here in Australia, beneficiaries of the British colonial endeavour that enabled non-Indigenous Australians to be here through choice or design. My ancestry on one side goes back to Henry Cohen, one of the first Jewish convicts who himself didn't come out by choice, but through whose journey and history I am able to be one of his descendants as a 7th generation Jewish Australian. But I also affirm acknowledging Indigenous elders as an affirmation of the Indigenous custom, or minhag as we would say in Jewish tradition, or practice of connecting to other communities the practice of welcome to country is, I understand, a custom of welcoming and inviting others into community, practicing our connections as humans to each other and the earth and environment on which we rely. It is one of the themes that I will return to in this oration. I'm particularly honoured to be invited to present the 2024 Sister Shirley Sedawie Oration at this AGM. The list of previous presenters is available on the Council's website, going back to Rabbi Levi's 2013 inaugural oration, where he presented the story of Sister Shirley and the start of the Council and Christians of Jews in Victoria. The last 4 orations are all available to view on YouTube, perhaps following the 2020 oration being delivered on Zoom from Jerusalem. One of the positive aspects of the COVID experience is how much we can now connect through the internet and see things that we may have missed live that are recorded. So I'm saying hello now to those of you watching on YouTube after the event by virtue of not being here in person. I also want to share my delight in being asked to present this oration because my own links to this council, before saying a few more words about Sister Shirley Sedawie herself. Unfortunately, Rabbi John Levi is not here in person today, but we know he is one of the founders, and I have known John Levi by virtue of growing up in Melbourne, and his parents-in-law, Kitty and Ben Selby, were very great friends of my maternal grandparents, Keith and Bobby Joseph. And by having attended Temple Beth Israel myself in Kew, growing up in Melbourne. My bat mitzvah was with Rabbi Brian Fox in 1978, but also through my involvement with the Reform Zionist Youth Movement Netzer from about the age of 14 or 15 in the late 70s, early 80s, where I came to know Rabbi Levi myself. But my more direct connection to this organisation is through the late Reverend Professor Robert Anderson, AM. And I can hear just in the murmurs in the room, you'll remember he was the chair of this council from its inception in 1985 through to 1990, and who was the subject of the oration in 2014 when on the 10th of August, Dr. John Bodycombe, OAM, spoke about the legacy of Reverend Professor Robert Anderson, who had died earlier that year on the 3rd of March 2014, aged 85. I first met Robert Anderson in 1982 at the Presbyterian Ladies College speech night at the completion of the 1982 school year at the then newly opened Victorian Arts Centre, where, as PLC school captain, I had the responsibility of giving the school captain's speech, which I completed quoting Hillel, the sage and scholar. Robert Anderson had come on to the PLC Council during a very tense and heavy time in PLC's history, one that you can read more about in my book, The Vetting of Wisdom, Joan Montgomery and the Fight for PLC. I don't have the books like Alex's flyers out there, but you can Google it. It was published by Franklin Street Press in 2021, the year that Joan Montgomery turned 96. Indeed, we launched the book on her 96th birthday. Sadly, Robert didn't live to see that book launched, although I had interviewed him, and he features in the book as a member of the council of the school deeply involved in the fight for Joan Montgomery and the PLC as it was, with Joan as its principal. I attended Robert's funeral in 2014, taking Joan with me to the service at the North Balwyn Uniting Church, where Joan was also by then a congregant. But back in 1982, when I first met Robert, at what would have been the after party following the speech night, he was very generous about my school captain's speech and my reference to Hillel. He would have been 54, which is quite sobering to think, given I am now older than he was when I met him as a 16-year-old schoolgirl. On telling him that I was applying to do arts law at the University of Melbourne after my planned gap year in Israel with Netzer, he said that I should stay in contact with him. He was then principal of the Uniting Church of Australia's Theological Hall at Ormond College, and I had won a scholarship to be a non-resident student during my undergraduate student years from 1983 to 1987, benefiting from college life without having to live there. As a university student, I came along to some of the early meetings of this council in the newly founded Council of Christians of Jews because of my connection to Robert. Indeed, in John Bodicum's obituary published in the Uniting Church's Crosslight magazine, he wrote, "Robert was held in high esteem by Australian Jews and viewed with suspicion by some of his own community. In his own memoirs, Robert wrote, I often felt that I had greater acceptance within certain sections of the Jewish community than with my own church." I would have met Sister Shirley Sedawie through Robert Anderson, given she was one of those responsible with him in those early years of setting up the Council of Christians and Jews in Victoria, with Rabbi Dr. John Levi, Rabbi Ronald Lebowski and Reverend George Grant. And as a trailblazing woman, as Shirley certainly was in the efforts of this council, I'm particularly honoured to give this lecture today to recognise her efforts. Sister Shirley Sedawie was born on the 23rd of September 1924. Indeed, 6 days ago, we would have been celebrating her 100th birthday, but sadly she died at 87. She was a member, as Pat said, of the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion, building bridges of understanding between the Catholic Church and Jewish people in Australia. And beyond and after World War II, she was one of the co-founders, as I said, of this council. And after her passing in late 2011, the CCJV inaugurated this oration in 2013. Rabbi Levi and Mary Barbuto wrote the obituary that appears in The Age and is available to read through the Council's website if any of you want to return to it after today. But it is really important to recognise her here because very few Australians have made an impression on religious life as Sister Sedawie did on the international stage. She touched lives from a parish primary school in Ascot Vale to the grandeur of the Vatican, from Cotton Road Kew to the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, and to the Pontifical Gregorian Institute in Rome. She was born in Sydney. Her grandparents had migrated from Syria, and her father, Phil, was the first of his family to be born in Australia. She was formally admitted as a member of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion or Sion? How do we pronounce it properly? Sion. In 1946, either aged 21 or 22, and she joined the teaching staff at St Mary's Primary School in Ascot Vale. The teaching order, however, was founded in the 1840s by Theodore Radisbon, a French-born Jew who believed it was his vocation to convert Jews to Christianity. In the 1950s, when details of the Holocaust became better known, the order made the radical decision to accept as its mission the task of furthering understanding between Jews and Christians and combating anti-Semitism. Sister Sedawie, who had been given the name Sister Callistus, was teaching during this period of revolutionary change. And that change led to the Second Vatican Council and the historic document Nostra Aetate, which declared, "We are called to be in relationship and to dialogue with Jewish people." In 1962, when Sister Sedawie was in her late 30s, she went to Jerusalem to study. She studied Judaism and Hebrew. And when she returned, she founded the Centre for Jewish-Christian Dialogue in Box Hill. She began an MA at Melbourne University, majoring in Semitic languages and Middle Eastern thought. And then she completed that MA in 1970 with a thesis on the beginning of the conflict between Christians and Jews. Then in 1970, she relocated to Cotham Road, where an excellent library of Judaica and theology was established. Shalom, as it was called, became a place for lectures and meetings. An increasing number of Christian groups seeking knowledge about Judaism were welcomed. Many senior students at Our Lady of Zion College at Box Hill benefited from her biblical studies course, and survivors of the Shoah living in Melbourne found in her a trusted and lifelong friend. She became, as we've said, one of the founders of this council in Victoria and became an active member of the executive committee. In 1977, she returned to Jerusalem for further study, and she worked at the Sisters of Zion Centre for Biblical Formation, Ecce Homo, on Via Dolorosa in the Old City, overlooking the Temple Mount. And then, the following year, she joined an international team at the Centre for Jewish-Christian Relations in Rome, where she later became its director. She also worked with the Vatican's Department of Relations with Judaism and the Jewish people, and she lectured at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. On returning to Australia in 1988, 11 years later, she rejoined her community in Sydney, where Rabbi Raymond Apple of Sydney's Great Synagogue wrote that the breakthrough of establishing the Council of Christians and Jews there in 1988 was when Sister Shirley Sedawie returned to Australia. And, interestingly, while in New South Wales and true to her nature, she befriended Mum Shirl and the Aboriginal community at Dundara, and where she remained a staunch supporter of their community for the rest of her life. When she returned to Melbourne here in 1990, she was re-elected to the executive of this council and made an honorary life member in 1995, and was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for her services to the promotion of interfaith relations and understanding, and continued to work with the Victorian Council of Churches and the Anglican Affairs Commission. And returning to the Reverend Professor Robert Anderson, he wrote in his autobiography, "No one has contributed more to Christian-Jewish relations than Sister Shirley Sedawie." So I feel particularly honoured to be recognising her today in this actual lecture. And one of the themes of her life, of her commitment to the domestic and to the international, infuses my comments today around recalibrating citizenship in the 21st century. And as we've already all acknowledged, I present this oration at a pressing time in Australia and internationally, where we see rising polarisation in democratic countries and communities around the world, and more overt, publicly reported experiences of anti-Semitism in Australia and internationally. When Alex first approached me to give this oration last year, he wrote to me saying, "We are specifically interested in having you address the issue of the influence of religious extremism on democracies around the world." Note, this was before October the 7th, with a focus on Israel, the US and the UK. "I know this may not be quite your area," he wrote, "but I'm sure you'll be well qualified to speak on this issue." And then earlier this year, on reapproaching me for this year, he told me I was welcome to speak on whatever I liked, but I think we would appreciate a topic that is connected to the separation or not between church and state in our democracy. I'm sure you would have plenty to say in that space, particularly for a Christian and Jewish audience in an election year for both the United Kingdom and the United States. For me, both of these questions or themes and the condition in which we see Australia today and the world reflect the ways in which human beings connect and disconnect, whether it be through religion or politics or other forms of difference. And that speaks to the inherent tensions in the human condition, a desire to be connected and a desire to differentiate. And And if I link that back to Sister Sedawie's life of the domestic and the international, the frame of citizenship and democracy is a healthy and helpful way of thinking through how we might move forward at a time of increased tension, how to recalibrate as a cohesive and peaceful society, both domestically and internationally, recognising the human needs of sameness and difference. First, in using the term citizenship, I draw upon, and have since 2000 in my writing about citizenship, from the work of the US academic Linda Bosniak, when she started writing about thinking about citizenship beyond nation states in an article called Citizenship Denationalised. In her abstract, she explains that the premise that citizenship is necessarily a national enterprise finds much support in conventional political and legal thought. The view was perhaps most famously articulated this century by Hannah Arendt, who wrote that a citizen, quote, is by definition a citizen among citizens of a country among countries. A citizen's rights and duties, Arendt wrote, must be defined and limited, not only by those of their fellow citizens, but also by the boundaries of a territory. But Bosniak asked, is citizenship, in fact, inextricably linked and bound up with the nation state? Because she started to investigate whether citizenship can take place, and in particular whether it should take place beyond the boundaries of the nation. And this is what she started to do in her reflections on more and more of the commentary around citizenship back at the turn of the century in the early 2000s. Now, the term citizenship has been broadly used in a range of different circumstances. And Bosniak went on to explain that it is invoked to characterise modes of participation and governance, rights and duties, identities and communities. And in her paper, she said that the struggle over citizenship beyond the nation state was ultimately a struggle over the meaning of citizenship itself, which is what I'm wanting to turn to. What she says is that it is a struggle that matters because citizenship is a core concept in our political and moral and legal vocabularies. It is a concept that we know is not merely a description of the social world, but is fundamental to the fabric of a society. In other words, there is a great deal at stake in the way we use the term. So I want to untangle the different meanings of citizenship to assist us in thinking through the increased polarisation and fragmentation in societies and democracies, and the positive steps that I think each of us can all take to move beyond it, as we are all citizens in the various ways that I will explain. First is citizenship as legal status, very much connected to the nation state. Who is recognised by the nation state as a citizen? Who is an Australian citizen, for instance? And that legislative framework is always open to be interpreted in a narrow or in an open way. So we can see in some ways in its open way or in its inclusive way that from the very beginning in Australia, Indigenous Australians were full members in the formal legal sense, starting off as British subjects, and then in 1949, when the actual legal status of Australian citizen came into being, were recognised as Australian citizens by virtue of birth in territory. But whilst they were included in that formal sense, as I'll come on to explain in the other aspects of citizenship, they were not included, and we will return to that. But in current legal frameworks, when we think of who is and isn't a citizen in Australia, Ultimately, the government of the day makes those pronouncements, and we can come back to in discussion some of the ways that I would argue that the current government errs on the side of exclusion rather than inclusion, which sets a tone for notions of social cohesion and the connected nature of the fabric of society to this very day. But we can come back to that. Interestingly, in contrast, in Israel, citizenship is highly inclusive for Jewish people around the world, so that all the Jewish people in this room have a right to apply for and be granted, subject to certain conditions, Israeli citizenship. And Arab Israelis are also citizens. But again, in the same way that I'll return to with Indigenous Australians, we may see differences in the social, economic inclusion of different forms of citizens in Israeli society. And the reality is that each nation state, no matter who it includes in its formal legal sense, may differentiate in its practice of practical inclusion and membership, which we'll come back to. And here I'll move to that notion of citizenship as political participation. This is about active citizenship, whether one is a formal or not a formal citizen of the country. It's about encouraging connection in civic spaces. It's that traditional Republican, in its broadest sense of the term, notion of the good citizen, the active citizen, the person who contributes to the greater good of the community. And I really would commend all of the members of the Executive, the Council of Christians and Jews, and the life of Shirley Sedawie as a perfect example of not only necessarily being a citizen of Australia or a citizen of the world, but an active participant, the good citizen, the active civic-minded citizen. And that expression of citizenship as political participation is key to understanding the health of a liberal democratic structure. And here, I believe the polarisation that we're witnessing is a reflection of the diminution of trust in our political institutions. And so we need to think how we revitalise that trust. And to me, that is about changing the nature of the political structures to become more inclusive. When you think about it, most of the democratic political structures created around the world were formed at a time where there was not even universal suffrage. People like Shirley Sedawie wouldn't have had the right to vote. All the women in their room would not have had the right to vote. And other forms of exclusion were foundational to those democratic structures. And again, I'm happy to come back to this in our discussion afterwards. So that's our thinking about citizenship as political participation, engaging in the civic space. Then let's think of citizenship, which often is referred to as rights protection. The International Human Rights Framework is around personhood, not legal citizenship. We are entitled to rights as human beings, yet the expression and claim of those rights is still trapped by nation states in their fruition. You can only claim them in the international system by requiring the sovereign state, the nation state, to actually implement their activation. And that hasn't worked so well in some nation states, including democratic nations like Australia. And again, Indigenous Australians' experience is a perfect example of the gap between the holding of the formal status of being a citizen and the rights that flow. Specifically in Australia, Indigenous Australians did not have the right to freedom of movement around the country until our recent history, and the right to vote, a basic notion, as I've alluded to with universal suffrage, was not granted to either men or women Indigenous Australians until 1962. And then, in that broader sense of the referendum in 1967, that was about the counting of Indigenous Australians for the purposes of constitutional arrangement of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So again, even though they were formal citizens, the framework of rights protection in Australia, a framework that still to this very day is not implemented in either constitutional or legislative terms, was differentiated between citizens. Just by being a citizen didn't entitle you to those rights. And then finally, another way in which Bosniak uses the term citizenship or unpacks it for us, we've seen citizenship as status, citizenship as political participation, and citizenship as rights so far. The final one is citizenship as identity. And this is where I think we need to come back to Bosniak's central argument of a desire for a commitment to a vision for citizenship that is multiple and overlapping, not a binary concept of in and out, but in an inclusive, multiple conception, an overlapping conception of the human condition of not being one or another in any context, but by identifying through our very different forms of identity in different contexts and in multiple ways. And it is here that I want to come to the concept of polarisation and anti-Semitism here, and in polarisation in many countries. As the political philosopher Philip Milacek has written on a piece on the negative impact of polarisation on democracy, he states that a certain degree of polarisation in a democratic system is not only normal, but also desirable, because it offers voters clear programmatic alternatives, which increases their interests in political processes, thus stabilising the democratic system. In other words, we don't want everybody to be thinking the same thing, but we want a framework in which we can, in a healthy and respectful way, encourage the engagement with difference, encourage engagement in a secure democratic framework with the other. And this is where I feel that we need to focus on how best to manage or organise to enhance our democracy so that we do not inflame difference, which is what polarisation normally makes us think of, but to draw from and be guided by responsible leadership in managing difference. Milacek goes on to say, the identity divide will only transform into a toxic polarisation if instrumentalised by political entrepreneurs so as to use exclusionary and demagogic rhetoric to introduce an us versus them characterisation of the political system. And is this, I feel, that we have seen over the past period, not only in Australia but around the world. But I did want to reflect, given that the occurrence of October the 7th last year occurred at the same time as the Voice referendum. Of course, October the 7th was exactly a week before October the 14th's vote for the Voice. And it is here where I feel the strong political leadership that had been set in place well before the vote for the Voice, indeed for 10 years of work that led to the referendum. For back in 2015, a bipartisan reconciliation council had been set up, built off 3 earlier reports pre-2015 to Parliament about constitutional recognition to rectify that distinction that I was talking about between Indigenous Australians and their fuller citizenship in terms of the constitutional underpinning of the base of our democratic system. That council was a bipartisan project including both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members that led to a series of First Nations dialogues which led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Yet that bipartisan approach that landed on an approach to constitutional change was then disrupted by seeking to characterise what was an inclusionary model with, and I quote, exclusionary and demagogic rhetoric to introduce an us versus them characterisation of the political system. That disruption, in my view, set the stage in Australia for the further polarisation that we witnessed throughout the Voice campaign and straight into the post-October 7th amplification of difference. Indeed, during that campaign, there were strong anti-Semitic elements in the No campaign, where the whole Voice campaign was characterised by some extremist groups as a Jewish conspiracy, referring to Mark Liebler as the chair of the council, Mark Dreyfus as the Attorney General, and Julian Leeser as the then Shadow Attorney General, and even identifying my own advocacy around the Voice, all as part of a Jewish conspiracy. And sadly, while this was directly addressed as farcical by the Prime Minister in Parliament at the time, it was also part of an overt racist commentary of misinformation that was hard to tackle because of the lack of civics and citizenship basic knowledge, another point that we can come back to in discussion. So Milicic argues citizens' assemblies are a way forward, to be understood as a method to mitigate polarisation, to indeed focus on highly polarised issues, but within a strengthened democratic framework. And here, that idea of participation, using the term citizenship assemblies, is where we need to re-engage the citizenry through this act of active participation. So in conclusion, I want to return to Sister Sedawie and the purpose of this council. Let's just look at the purposes of the Council of Christians and Jews, which exists to educate Christians and Jews to appreciate each other's distinct beliefs and practices and their common ground. That commitment to multiple commitments of difference and sameness, to promote the study of and research into historical, political, economic, social, religious and racial causes of conflict between people of different creeds and colour, to promote for the benefit of the community education in those fundamental ethical teachings that are common to Christianity and Judaism, which relate to respect and understanding between people of different creeds, or indeed I would add no creed at all, to that human endeavour for connection, but at the same time respecting difference. And as your statement on the website says, with the aid of all people of goodwill, individually or organisationally, we need to combat all forms of discrimination and prejudice. We need to see anti-Semitism in that broader framework of racism, of improper exercises of power. We need to rebuild the belief in the democratic project by refashioning that project to be more inclusive of all. So I see the aims of this council to be consistent with what should be advocated in society more broadly, not only about religion, but all forms of difference. We need to engage and learn and understand. That is necessary for all efforts to recalibrating citizenship in each of its different meanings in the 21st century. And I hope that my thinking about these endeavours has paid sufficient tribute to the late Sister Shirley Sedawie and all of your work. Thank you.
But I'm sure there are comments and questions from the floor, and so we invite those now, please.
Thank you very much for that, Kim. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested in your description of a kind of a continuum between the yes, the vote for
Yes.
Aboriginal recognition and the rise of anti-Semitism
Yes.
here in the light of October 7th.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if they hadn't juxtaposed in the way that they actually did.
Yes.
Do you think there still would have been this reaction of people to
Look,
the events of October 7th?
That's a really fair question, Fred. And I think that there is no question in my mind that that mood in the community created an openness for what happened on October the 7th and made it more difficult to contain, because there was such an acceptance of openly racist commentary as part of the voice. But I think it would be disingenuous to say that there wouldn't have been any of the rise of criticism of Israel and the links and the difficulties in determining the difference between that and anti-Semitism, because we know that that has been a long and ongoing reality of the experience of Jews in the diaspora in thinking through what was happening in Israel. But also to remember what was happening in Israel pre-October the 7th. There were many of us around the diaspora calling attention to the breakdown of democratic institutions in Israel. And so there was also a heightened awareness of the fragility of democracy in Israel. And in many ways, that challenge for Jews outside of Israel was reminding us of that sort of really important imperative that for Israel to maintain its democratic identity and to reflect what, as diaspora Jews talk about, is the only democracy in the Middle East, that was under strain in and of itself. And there is really another entire lecture about what's happened in Israel in terms of those notions of division within Israel, so that the Jewish people living in Israel, as we know, is not a homogeneous collection of people. There are white Jews and black Jews. There are the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi Jews. And so the tensions of difference and sameness play out in Israel as well. So I think the answer is that it was worse than it would have otherwise been, but I think that there would have been elements. But I think perhaps they would have been a little bit more containable if the nature of society wasn't as fragmented as it was before it occurred.
As someone who has been involved in the Australian Electoral Commission for donkey's years, may I say one of the glories of the Australian Constitution is what I call compulsory voting. It is very unique in the world. There's only about 7 other countries who have compulsory voting. And the fact that we have compulsory voting in Australia is one of the ways in which all of us, whether we like it or not, are forced to contribute to the continuation of the democratic tradition.
Well, can I add something there? Because I do also believe that compulsory voting is an aspect of our democracy. But what I think the constitutional referendum reminded us is that if you require people to vote, they need to have a certain level of understanding and education. Because what did happen in that instance of compulsory voting was a proliferation of misinformation, which then impacted on those people who had to vote and had never really thought about it before, or didn't have enough constitutional knowledge or understanding, and not in a patronising sense, but just in the reality of our civics and citizenship system, to be able to be misled, in my view. And so in some ways that was a downfall of compulsory voting, because such a significant number of people without the knowledge influenced an outcome that I believe will lead to, a lot of a significant period of disharmony and that we need to work on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all that you've said. Thank you too for what you've said about Shirley as an example of what you're talking about. I wanted to ask you a question about being citizens of our planet Earth.
Yes.
Because some people are starting to promote that type of understanding. So I'd be pleased to hear your comments.
So thank you. It's almost like a Dorothy Dixon for me, because I have written about citizenship in an age of globalisation, and I think this is the other aspect that Shirley's life work shows, that the importance of not only connecting domestically but internationally, because there is that common. Well, the environmental pressures upon us are of course not going to be divided up by borders. I mean, there will be some countries who will entirely lose their borders. I don't know if any of you heard one of the ministers from Tuvalu talking about a future of a meta citizenship, or a digital citizenship, because they won't have a land any longer, but they'll have a national history and culture that they don't want to lose. But I think that is the other pressing aspect of it, that the common human need to connect around the globe is so fundamental. And we have to recognise that people live very different lives all around the globe. So it's that difference but connection that becomes so pressing. And we haven't yet solved a way to manage power in that situation. I mean, there's another entire really presentation on the nature of power and how power is exercised, and the disjuncture really between the people on the ground, the active citizens on the ground who are doing wonderful jobs on all of this area, and how different that is to the power structures of those who are actually exercising power at this moment, who are not paying enough heed to the needs of the very people that they're meant to be representing.
My question probably flows nicely off yours. It was I was contemplating the 4 different elements of citizenship that you were speaking about in your speech, Kim, and just how each one of them is so complicated, and there's so many different understandings of each of those, and issues that juxtapose against each other. So in unraveling the citizenship, the contemplation is, do we just, not simply, but is this a time for new language? Because as soon as you say that word, it comes to each individual with different history, different understandings, different notions. And I must say, sometimes I'm inspired by some of our youth, where the 13-year-olds of today actually have made up this whole new language, which I can't understand, but they understand it, which is almost a way to say we can create almost a new language where we keep it simple, and that grassroots citizenship. What is a citizen? A good civil person, a good civil contributor or actor can be detached from citizenship per se.
Well, in essence, in many ways, the Bosniak piece is trying to make that point. That indeed the way in which we engage with these concepts is so influenced by the different frameworks in which they operate. But I guess her take is to say that those concepts will continue, and what we all need to do as citizens is interrogate them and play them out in their right context. And I really do feel here in Australia that, citizenship as a concept has been so misused and used in ways that are actually exclusionary rather than inclusion, about inclusion and social cohesion, that if we were to address that in a more fundamental way, we could then draw out some of these issues. But I think language, as you say, is so hard to budge, that if we could come up with something that would emancipate our thinking more, that would be a good.
On this issue of what we need to be the same. And a few people organisations have come up with ethics, like the Parliament of World Religions, Global Ethic, and the Giant Occupation. I believe they're all new failures, because I think it's a lot harder to actually come up with a good ethic than people think. But I think St. Paul actually did a great job. And I'll speak with you after this.
Okay, all right. Look, I do think, as I sort of advocated at the beginning and Shirley's message, if we each take it upon ourselves to be engaged individuals, contributing to knowledge, and when we hear things that don't accord with our understanding, to respectfully engage with the other, that has to be a model of a better way. We know that not everybody is going to join in, we see that. But in each and every way that each of us can do that, I think it's incumbent on us. And I also think there is a greater mission about the structures of power in society to better reflect that spirit of cohesion and connection as human beings.
It's my pleasure to thank you for such a stimulating and interesting lecture. Thank you so much. You'll be pleased to know that the executive still meets at Sion in Cotham Road, thanks to the sisters, and we appreciate your hospitality for our meetings very much. But thank you for opening up such an interesting reflection on citizenship. I suspect, like most people here are probably like me. I have a passport and I vote, and beyond that I don't think very much about it. And yet you have given us many dimensions. It was rather like a diamond, where we see many facets of this gift of citizenship. And not forgetting, of course, there's we all share in a citizenship of a greater creation, and anticipation of that. But thank you so much for such a stimulating and interesting lecture. I've also discovered the British courts sent each of us ancestors, Jewish ancestors. I have a Jewish ancestor too, who came through the court system to come to Australia. Someone said to me, well, he wasn't a very good Jew, was he? But lovely to make that connection. But we have a gift to thank you, and thank you so much. Thank you so much.